Hey folks, Tim Muldoon back for day 9 of Ignatian mindfulness, and here in Boston it's finally a sunny day, not as freezing. Yay for that. Small victories. I have recommended, you may remember from yesterday's talk, that it's a good idea to reconnect with nature. Why? Because nature distracts us in lovely, lovely ways. So if you haven't done this, I would very much recommend that you go outside and even for an extended time, take 30 minutes, take an hour. My students have to do an hour of paying attention to nature and to really, really watch what happens with their senses. It's a great way to kind of re-establish a connection with just our own presence of mind in these difficult times. Now, that's yesterday's talk. I want to talk about something different today, but something which is related and certainly comes directly out of not only the Ignatian tradition, but from Saint Ignatius of Loyola himself. And it's known in insider circles as the principle of indifference. And that word, don't get too stuck on it for a moment. I'll get to that in just a moment. It's called in other traditions detachment, but the basic logic, I think, is similar, that we don't want to get too tied to any one thing in particular. Now, all of us are having this whole lab experience in a kind of indifference. Why? Because almost everything that we're used to has been kind of yanked away from us. So our routines, our usual places of being, our ways of relating to other people, very fundamental things. I mean, heck, even, more kind of consequential things like access to food. It's hard to shop these days. Dare I mention toilet paper, but that's a story for another day. My point again is that in this age of having to change so many things, the principle of indifference is a call to a certain kind of mindfulness. So, what do I mean? Indifference here, by the way, is not what we usually think of as, whatever, anything's fine. Instead, indifference is the fruit of the spiritual practice of recognizing that good can come from whatever situation I am in. In its kind of classic statement, it's from the first principle and foundation that Ignatius of Loyola writes about in his spiritual exercises, in which he basically says, look, I shouldn't want a long life or a short one. I shouldn't want health or sickness. I shouldn't care whether I'm rich or poor. I should only care for that which leads me to the end for which God has created me. The reason I think this is such a good and really salutary idea to grab onto today, even if you're not coming at this specifically from a position of faith, it's that, well, again, practically, there's a lot that we can no longer control. We're in situations that we've been thrust into, and so practicing indifference becomes, I think, for me at least, a really important response. Now, what do I mean by practicing indifference? Here I'm borrowing from something else that Ignatius writes about elsewhere in the spiritual exercises. He even uses the phrase, I should make myself indifferent, which I think on the face of it might strike some people as, well, how do you do that? I mean, either you are or you aren't. But the point is this, that we can, in fact, practice a certain indifference. Why? Well, because I think what we can do is remind ourselves that our vision is only goes so far. We can only know so much about what ultimately is good for us. So let me just use an example. Let's say that I hurt myself. I sprain an ankle, I twist a knee, whatever it is, and I'm laid up in bed. And as a consequence of this, I get really bored and restless, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is awful. Now, in the context of this principle of indifference, maybe I say to myself something like this: oh, okay, I can't go for a run today. I can't do, the normal things I do, just even getting around the house. Maybe this is an opportunity to catch up on my reading. And maybe there's a long-term good that comes from exactly that kind of a practice. Now, I use that example because that is in fact what happened to Ignatius himself. When he was a young man, he was wounded in battle, he was laid up in bed for months, terribly, terribly bored, and it was through reading that he had this profound awakening to who he was and what he could do. More on that in another episode. For us, the point is that if we just kind of take a step back from the immediate observation, everything is terrible, everything's been taken away from us, then we can develop a certain mindfulness that allows us to say, maybe this is an opportunity. And notice, by the way, I'm not even saying, those of us that aren't sick or that, otherwise are, let's say bored. Anybody can practice indifference. And Ignatius meant it in these very serious ways. We shouldn't want health or sickness. So I think of the story of a Jesuit writer who once made the observation that he was going off to work in a foreign country and was all excited about wanting to serve the poor in this very poor region of the world. And he got sick as soon as he was there. And he brought this to his spiritual director and basically said, I can't believe that I can't do anything. I'm sick. I'm laid up in bed. And the spiritual director, I think very wisely, said, well, why not just be sick? Why not just be wherever you are? And he, was able to say that, okay, maybe there's some good in this. Now, let me not make light at all of those that are facing very serious illnesses and maybe even close to death, or those of us maybe that have people around us that are very seriously sick or facing death. That's not anything to make light of. But in a certain sense, it really pushes us in the direction of where Ignatius wanted us to go, which is to say this, that ultimately the meaning of our lives is likely to be greater than that which we can easily put our finger on in the moment. And by the way, of course, we're talking about a saint. We're talking about a person that ultimately placed himself in the hands of God and said, effectively, whatever good is going to happen in my life, it's going to be ultimately for God's greater glory. And that was the phrase that became very well known in Jesuit circles. So back to our situation. My simple point is, allow yourself to let go of whatever the immediate plans might be and develop a certain mindfulness of just what is there today, in the moment. Simple things like being able to have a meal, or being able to wear comfortable shoes, or being able to breathe well, or being able to reach out to a friend or a loved one by your favorite video conferencing platform or by phone or whatever. These small things might become larger, and over the long term, they might well be for our greater good, which ultimately perhaps we don't have full control over. So with that thought, I leave you for today. Again, thank you for listening.